I watched her documentary before she ever became big. I think I seen it on PBS, on Channel 13. You can tell she was a rough. She had anger problems. She was not ladylike. She was nigga boy, tomboy. Nah, and she, nigga, she went through the process and corrected what needed to be corrected to represent what a champ is. She ain't no Layla Ali. None of our new youth are what our old stars used to be. They got their own mind, they got their own identity. So nah, man, homie, they picking on Claressa. And can't nobody whoop her. So
for a long time, the public was shown a clean, polished picture. A champion at the top of her game. A couple that looked strong, successful, and unbreakable. From the outside, it felt like a perfect mix of love, praise, and applause. But Charleston didn't attack that image. He gently pressed on it like checking for cracks beneath the surface. What if this wasn't only about feelings? What if some of it was about planning, image, and timing? What if the story people believed was carefully shaped to protect something bigger than a relationship? He didn't accuse anyone. He didn't call names. He simply connected moments and let people draw their own conclusions. He reminded everyone that Claressa Shields didn't come from comfort or calm beginnings. She was bold, emotional, and real before she became a public figure. Over time, she wasn't just trained to win in the ring. She was shaped into a symbol, a name that carried value, a reputation that had to stay clean and controlled. That's where things started to feel heavier. While the spotlight stayed on victories and celebrations, there were other forces working quietly in the background. Money, image, influence, protection. And beside her wasn't just a partner in love, but someone who also stood between her and the outside world. Charleston didn't say this was wrong or right. He let the pattern speak for itself. And when you look at it that way, the silence around certain moments starts to feel less like loyalty and more like a choice. Because real affection doesn't usually need this much planning. True care doesn't rely on this much quiet. And when something feels more like an agreement than a connection, people begin to wonder. From that point forward, the story around Claressa Shields and Papoose didn't feel simple anymore. It felt layered, complex, and open to questions that may never have clear answers.
So Claressa Shields wants to have babies with Papoose while he's still married to Remy.
They gonna look like African kids, Ugandan babies. Yeah. They ain't gonna know if them babies Nigerian, Jamaican, or Haitian. But they gonna have some pretty chocolate skin. Don't know if their hair gonna be too straight or wavy. They may have African hair. But they sure gonna be nigga kids. Yeah. They gonna be some smart kids that know how to fight.
What made this moment feel so strange wasn't how loud Charleston White spoke. It was how steady and careful his words were. He didn't sound like someone trying to win an argument. He sounded like someone reminding people of things they had chosen not to see. This wasn't a speech full of anger. It felt more like a new way of looking at the same story. And once that view changed, the picture around Claressa Shields and Papoose started to shift in a quiet but powerful way. Charleston never questioned Claressa's skill or hard work. He focused instead on what surrounded her success. He talked about the system that grew around her, not to tear her down, but to point out how much effort went into keeping her image steady. In his view, the real danger in fame isn't falling down. It's becoming so important that no one feels allowed to question you anymore. He suggested that Claressa's rise wasn't only about training and winning. It was also about shaping how the world saw her. Her public personality looked bold and honest, yet every move seemed carefully guided. Matches were chosen with care. Public moments were handled gently. What fans saw as raw emotion, he described as something polished to protect a valuable name. Then he turned his attention away from the spotlight and toward the people standing nearby. The ones who don't talk much, but help decide who gets close and who stays out. That's where he placed Papoose. Not as a dramatic figure in a love story, but as someone who brought calm and balance to the public image. Always there, never loud. A steady presence that didn't need to explain itself. Charleston didn't say Papoose controlled Claressa. He talked about something more complicated. He described a situation where support and reliance begin to mix. The same person who blocks criticism can also be the one who decides which voices get heard. In that kind of setup, quiet stops being neutral. It becomes a choice, even a rule. From that point, the relationship started to look less like romance and more like a partnership built for stability. Charleston hinted that both sides gained something. Claressa received protection from chaos and a sense of order around her growing fame. Papoose gained visibility and a place near influence. Together, they appeared strong, safe, and solid in a world that values a clean image. This is where Remy Ma came back into the conversation. Charleston suggested her absence wasn't random. He painted her as someone who speaks openly, challenges stories, and doesn't stay silent when things feel wrong. In his view, that kind of energy doesn't fit well in a system that depends on control and smooth appearances. He didn't claim anyone planned anything behind closed doors. He simply pointed to patterns. Certain voices get louder. Others fade away. Stories change, not always because the truth changes, but because what benefits the image changes. Toward the end, Charleston touched on the question many people kept asking. Why does Papoose stay quiet? Why doesn't he argue back or defend himself in public? And that's where his words landed the hardest. He suggested that sometimes silence isn't about weakness or fear. Sometimes it's about knowing exactly when not to speak, because the quiet itself keeps everything in place.
Yeah, that nigga Papoose, and this is why I say that. You ain't never heard no hoe come out and say nothing bad about him first. Even when this hoe was doing wrong, he wasn't running to the internet bashing her. And he don't speak much. He's a man of silence, so that means his words are important to him. I done seen him get with 2 women, and seemed like he brought the best out of both women. Yeah, I don't know too many niggas that go hold their girl down when they go to jail.
That silence was not shown as innocence. It was shown as control. Charleston suggested that discipline often gets confused with doing the right thing. When someone stays quiet in public, people usually think they have nothing to hide. But sometimes it simply means they understand how powerful it can be to hold back instead of speaking out. In his view, silence is not empty. It can be a choice that shapes how others see the story. From there, the tone grew heavier. Charleston started talking about what happens when a person's career reaches a high point, but their sense of self stops growing. When attention begins to fade, being close to influence can become the fastest way back into view. He did not say Papoose took advantage of Claressa. He said that chances often appear for those who are ready to step into them. When one person looks for safety and the other looks for access, people call it love because that sounds better than calling it a plan. He pushed the idea that Claressa's world slowly changed. It became less about the sport itself and more about how everything looked from the outside. Taking risks mattered less. Protecting the image mattered more. In that kind of space, anyone who asked hard questions did not seem like a critic. They seemed like a threat to the whole setup. Charleston also turned his focus toward the larger industry. He asked why so many voices that speak about strength and fairness suddenly went quiet when deeper questions came up. He wondered why media kept repeating the same safe stories instead of digging further. To him, that kind of wide silence is not neutral. It is a form of agreement. When enough people choose not to speak, a single version of events becomes the only one that exists. As he kept talking, a clear pattern began to form. Control does not usually arrive with noise or drama. It settles in slowly. It shows up as protection, as care, as loyalty. Over time, the person in the center may stop seeing where their own choices end and where the system around them begins. One of Charleston's most uncomfortable points was about physical strain. He said that repeated damage, injury after injury, can create a deep sense of need. When someone feels worn down, stability starts to feel more important than freedom. The people closest to them become necessary, not just helpful. Not because they give strength, but because life without them feels impossible to imagine. He did not talk about heroes or villains. He talked about reasons and rewards. Then he stepped back and widened the view. This, he said, was not only about Claressa or Papoose or anyone else involved. It was about how many public relationships now work like agreements. Who brings value? Who offers safety? Who manages access? Who takes on risk? And who gets replaced when the balance changes? Charleston reframed the entire story. He said it was not a romance that failed. It was an arrangement that followed its purpose until it reached its end. When a connection is built on usefulness instead of trust, the break does not come with tears and shouting. Comes quietly, step by step. The truth does not burst out. It leaks little by little until no amount of image control can hold it back. What made this part so uncomfortable was not the words themselves. It was how much of it suddenly seemed to fit. The conversation moved away from personalities and toward how systems work when money, attention, and reputation mix together. Charleston did not describe chaos. He described efficiency. And to him, efficiency is never romantic. It is careful. It is planned. It is designed to reduce danger and increase results. He pointed out something subtle. When one person helps decide what reaches the public and what does not, they also shape what feels real. Not by force, but by filtering. What gets shown? What gets softened? What never makes it through at all? From the outside, it can still look like support. But Charleston suggested that Claressa's world had become carefully arranged. Fewer moments without a script. Fewer tough questions. More safety wrapped in the language of loyalty. In that space, love does not vanish. It changes form. It becomes security. It becomes leverage. It becomes a kind of insurance. Then he talked about money not as greed but as structure. When one person earns much more, the public rushes to label the other. He rejected those labels. He said the issue was not about taking. It was about having access without resistance, about being treated as if the resources belong to both, even when they legally do not. That difference, he argued, shifts the focus from stealing to alignment. And alignment, in his view, is the base of many modern power relationships. You do not need ownership when you have influence. You do not need authority when you have closeness. That is where he paused and faced the question people keep asking, even if they are not sure they want the answer.
She also makes more money than him, similar to Remy Ma. So would you consider him a gold digger?
No. A player ain't never been a gold digger. That nigga's a player. Nigga, that smooth player, nigga. Now, man, now, you always supposed to play for the bank. My grandmama told me, if a woman really like you, it ain't nothing she won't do for you. Well, grandmama, how you know if she really like you? She'll give you her money.
What made that moment so powerful was not the way Charleston White spoke, but what his words suggested beneath the surface. He did not frame generosity as a trick or a way to control someone. Instead, he described it as a form of proof. In his view, love often shows itself through time, effort, and shared resources. When someone can move freely within what you own, what you earn, and what you protect, it says a lot about how the balance of power is set up. You may not notice it at first, but over time, that access becomes a quiet sign of who holds the upper hand. Charleston then widened his focus. He argued that people spend too much energy debating who earns more money, while missing the deeper question. The real issue, he said, is not income. It is control. Who decides which stories get told and which ones never reach the public? Who chooses when to speak and when to stay silent? Who sets the rules for what is considered private and what becomes public? In that kind of system, silence itself becomes a form of value. It can protect reputations, calm storms, and keep uncomfortable questions from spreading. He described quiet people as powerful in a different way. Loud voices may grab attention, but they also create conflict. Silent ones, he said, often shape the room without being noticed. When someone rarely reacts, others do not know how to challenge them. That uncertainty can become a shield. In a world driven by headlines and drama, the person who stays still can sometimes become the hardest to reach. This is where Remy Ma came back into the conversation, not as an emotional figure but as a structural one. Charleston suggested that she represented unpredictability. She spoke openly. She did not soften conflict to make things look better. She did not adjust her words to fit a clean image. And in systems that depend on safety and polish, unpredictability is risky. From that angle, her absence from the main story did not look like heartbreak. It looked like a risk being removed. He went further and said that the industry itself benefits from simple, clean stories. Controlled relationships are easier to explain. Carefully shaped images are easier to defend. When critics raise questions, they are often dismissed as jealous or negative. That response does not need a meeting or a plan. It happens naturally because people prefer comfort over discomfort. Supporting a familiar story feels safer than pulling it apart. One of the most unsettling parts of Charleston's view was how he described the life cycle of these kinds of relationships. He said that when a bond is built on usefulness, it rarely ends in a loud public crash. Instead, it fades. When the balance of value changes, when the protection is no longer needed, or when the influence shifts, the connection quietly loses its purpose. Small details stop lining up. Actions no longer match words. Loyalty begins to feel more like duty than devotion. He also tied this idea to physical and emotional strain. Repeated effort, repeated pain, and constant pressure can wear a person down. When someone feels tired or vulnerable, stability starts to matter more than independence. The people closest to them become more than companions. They become anchors. That kind of dependence is not always forced. Often, it grows naturally because the promise of safety feels like relief. Charleston did not speak in terms of villains and victims. He talked about incentives. He talked about what people gain, what they protect, and what they risk losing. Then he stepped back and said this was not only about a few well-known names. It was about a larger pattern. Public relationships, especially in spaces like sports, music, and media, often begin to work like agreements. Each person brings something. One brings attention. One brings protection. One brings access. One absorbs criticism. When those roles are clear, the connection can last. When they shift, the structure weakens. He reframed marriage and long-term commitment in a practical way. He did not describe them as pure romance. He described them as planning, shared responsibility, and preparation for pressure. In his view, when people treat relationships as only feelings, they can fall apart when emotions change. But when they treat them as shared work, they are more likely to survive challenges. The irony, he suggested, is that many people reject the idea of relationships as contracts, yet end up in situations that function exactly like one, just without clear terms. What made his words uncomfortable was how familiar they sounded. He suggested that modern celebrity relationships are not built for honesty. They are built for presentation. They are designed to protect brands, soften backlash, and keep the story moving forward. In that environment, being open can become a risk. Being vulnerable can invite trouble. Silence becomes the safest choice. Charleston described how couples in the public eye are often judged not by how much they care, but by how useful they are to each other's image. Who helps combat press? Who brings new attention? Who makes the story look stable? When those questions become more important than trust or affection, the relationship starts to feel less like a connection and more like a system. He pointed out that these systems rarely collapse in a dramatic way. There is no big announcement, no sudden confession. Instead, there is distance. There are fewer shared moments. There are careful statements that say very little. Over time, the protection fades, and what once felt untouchable becomes open to doubt. Another idea he returned to was longevity. People often think that if something lasts a long time, it must be real and strong. Charleston challenged that. He said that in controlled environments, lasting does not always mean loving. It can mean effective. It can mean the arrangement is still working. When it stops working, the silence that once protected it begins to crack. He did not predict a specific ending. He talked about inevitability. If a bond is built on alignment instead of honesty, it cannot easily adapt when circumstances change. If money, attention, or relevance shifts, the connection may not grow with it. It may simply fade away. One of his most striking points was about transactions. He said that many people do not realize they are in a transactional relationship because transactions do not always look like trades. Sometimes they look like favors. Sometimes they look like protection from criticism. Sometimes they look like someone handling the noise so the other person can focus on their work. But every exchange has a cost. In his view, the cost in these situations is often independence. He suggested that Claressa did not lose her sense of control all at once. It faded slowly. It faded through filtered access to the outside world, through voices being dismissed before they were even heard, through criticism being labeled as jealousy or negativity. The most dangerous part, he said, is that this process can feel like safety while it is happening. He also returned to the idea of physical wear. Injuries and exhaustion do not just affect the body, they affect how a person thinks. Pain can narrow focus. Tiredness can reduce resistance. When someone is in that state, letting another person manage the outside world can feel like a relief rather than a loss of freedom. At that point, his commentary stopped sounding like gossip and started sounding like a warning. He said this pattern shows up everywhere. In entertainment, in politics, in business, anywhere image matters more than truth. Anywhere silence is rewarded. Anywhere asking the wrong question can get you pushed aside. He did not let the audience off the hook either. He talked about how fans play a role in keeping these systems alive. Applause can discourage curiosity. Defending an image can become more important than protecting a person. Questioning a story can be treated like an attack instead of a search for understanding. In that way, silence is not only enforced from above, it is supported from below. He then spoke about legacy. What remains when the spotlight fades? What is left when the brand no longer needs to be defended? He suggested that the hardest realizations often come later, when people look back and see the signs they ignored. By then, the answers may not bring comfort. They may only bring regret. He circled back to commitment one last time. He described it as shared risk, planning, and accountability. Not just feeling, but responsibility. He said that many people resist this idea, yet still enter relationships that operate with the same rules, only without honesty about what those rules are. What made the story unsettling was not that someone was clearly right or wrong. It was the idea that everyone might simply be playing a role, following incentives, protecting what they value, staying quiet until quiet no longer works. Charleston did not end with anger. He ended with clarity. He did not say what would happen next. He said that systems do not fall apart because someone exposes them. They fall apart when they stop being useful, when the cost of keeping them becomes greater than the benefit. He reminded people that truth does not always need a loud voice. Sometimes it moves quietly. It spreads through small moments. It waits for the right time. Silence, he said, only has power as long as people believe it means something else.